Good morning, Professor Crystal. It's a pleasure to see you this wonderful day.
Good day to you. It's a delight to be with you.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to greet you on behalf of two universities, actually. Moscow State University, the Lomonosov Moscow State University, which you know very well. You've been our honorable guests now in a number of our conferences here.
Listen, I remember being totally lost in that enormous building and not knowing which entrance and exit to use and finding myself in the wrong side and so on. Very happy memories of that visit, yes.
And simultaneously, we would do it together with the Financial University of Russia.
Yeah.
This is the government's university, and the people who are actually get training here, in the future, they're supposed to work in the government structures. So they're preparing for themselves to work in all sorts of analytical spheres, including language and intercultural communication. So this is going to be very important. Our talk today, our dialogue, is going to be extremely important for them all. The subject of our conference is actually change in the time of distancing. We want to understand what is happening to people, to communication, to language, in the epoch of internet, meaning the internet actually on the one hand, it brings people closer to one another, but at the same time, people actually lose a lot of information that they formerly had in their interpersonal communication, because no less than 70% of information is nonverbal, and our brain is in the habit of interpreting nonverbal information. Therefore, we are asking ourselves a very critical question, I think. What is happening to our language? Is communication imposing serious changes to how we're going to communicate in the future? What is going to happen to English in the future? Is it going to break into multiple diversities and varieties that will be determined by some local preferences and likes and dislikes? Or some other ways of communication will begin to emerge, and we shall have somehow to adapt to it in the global agenda of communication. What are your general thoughts about that? What do you think about this?
Well, you've raised two very big issues here, and I think it would be good to separate them. The issue of new varieties is one thing. Let's deal with that in a little while. The question of increasingly used internet communication is different from that, I think. But certainly the pandemic has shown us the way in which internet communication differs so much from traditional face-to-face interaction. One asks, what is the essential feature of a face-to-face conversation? And there are many features of difference, of course, but the one that strikes me as being more important than anything else is the existence of simultaneous feedback. In other words, when I'm talking to somebody, they are giving me immediate reaction to what I'm saying, and vice versa. So when they're talking, I'm saying things like, yeah, yeah, oh no, really? And so on. And not just vocalization, but of course, facial expression and gesture and everything is there. And the other person is focusing on me and I am focusing on them. And that refers to that nonverbal aspect that you mentioned a few minutes ago. Now that is critical. And if anybody doesn't believe me, all they've got to do is try it out as an experiment for themselves. Choose your target carefully, and at some point in the conversation, withhold that kind of simultaneous feedback. Simply do not do it. So the other person is talking to you and you just go like that. If you do, the conversation will break down immediately. The other person will wonder, sorry, hello, are you all right? Are you having a heart attack? Have I upset you in some way? They will not be able to make sense of it. They need that simultaneous feedback to make the conversation flow smoothly. Now, as soon as one says that, you can see the difference between that and any kind of online Zoom-like interaction. Because here is me now talking to you, and the situation is totally different from a face-to-face conversation. You're not giving me simultaneous feedback. How could you? And if there was more than one person on the screen in a gallery kind of view, I can't watch everybody anyway, and I don't know what they're doing. So I am on my own at the moment. I do not actually know how well I am doing as a conversationalist because I'm not getting the cues from you and from the others that might be in the room to let me know. So after a while, it begins, this autonomy begins to get a bit tiring. And that is why so many people after a Zoom conversation say, oh, I'm exhausted. You know, I'm glad that's over, especially if it's going on for an appreciable period of time. It's because they're not getting the simultaneous feedback that they need. And of course, if one is doing so much online lecturing and so on these days, it's online with the class distributed 50 faces all over the screen. You think it's a bit like a lecture room. No, it isn't, because in a lecture room, you can actually look around and see the reactions of everybody. But on a screen, you cannot look at all the individual people and get any sense of community feedback that there is in a lecture situation. So all of these things together add up to a very different type of scenario. Now, we are slowly getting used to it, but even so, after a year of extra Zoom type activity, the people I've been talking to say they're still finding it a problematic medium because of the lack of these cues. Now, the cues are not just simultaneous feedback. There are all kinds of linguistic cues that are missing as well. What's one of the things that's so important for conversation? Comment clauses. Now, for those of you who don't know your reference grammar, comment clauses is the term that people like Randolph Quirk and others use in their big comprehensive grammar of the English language to refer to expressions like, you know, you see, I mean, mind you, to be frank, to be perfectly honest, as a matter of fact. Now, there are dozens of these, hundreds of these in a language.
I remember David Abercrombie once was writing in one of his books on this subject. He was saying, in normal friendly conversation, it is most important to avoid silence. If somebody volunteers a piece of information or some exciting news, an answer is just as necessary as when a question is asked. So this is
absolutely the avoidance of silence. Right. At least in our culture. I mean, there are some cultures where silence is absolutely fine. I remember the first time I went to Japan, for instance, and was having a conversation, and there was a silence suddenly in the group that I was in, and I felt an urgent need to break that silence because it's not my culture for a silence, but from their point of view, this was fine. If there's to be a silence, then let there be a silence, you know. So there are some cultural differences here. But yes, things like you know and you see and I mean, they're like the oil that keeps the conversation flowing smoothly. They avoid silence. After all, what do I want to say next? A break just like that, a silence just like that? No, there are useful strategies that are used, hesitation noises, for example, but you can't just hesitate all the time. That's not going to work so well. And these things like, you know, you see, and I mean, they help they give the speaker time to think about what he wants to say next, and they give the listener time to process what is being said. So they're very valuable. And here's the point, that in internet conversations, they are largely absent. You hardly ever hear them. People just don't do them. And this is another factor that makes it difficult for those kinds of conversation to continue. So that's the first aspect of what you were asking a few minutes ago, Mark. I don't know whether there are other aspects of that before we move on to the question of varieties.
Yeah, well, there was one thing that I remember in connection with what you said. The psychologists were conducting an experiment between when there is a mother talking to a child. And normally, a child is made happy by her mother reacting in all sorts of ways, producing all sorts of noises, smiling, tinkling, ticking, and so on and so forth, doing all sorts of things in front of the child. And
Simultaneous feedback once again.
Yeah, exactly. But then suddenly they asked the mother just to stay there where she was and to continue smiling, but to stop producing noises of all kinds. After 5 minutes of such interaction, the child started crying severely. So because
Yes.
the child was expecting some sort of communication.
And actually, I think I would start crying too if that happened to me. Yeah, it is a very disturbing situation. And yet, you see, on the internet now, we cannot avoid it. We have to cope with this scenario. There is no alternative.
You know, the question is...
Let alone the problem of lag. You know, at the moment, our connection is very, very good. And we're hearing each other pretty speedily. But I was on a Zoom interaction with a country not so long ago, and the connection was very poor. And I would make my point, and there was a delay, sometimes of up to 10 seconds before the reaction could come through to me. And that was an impossible conversation to hold, really.
The question is, does it affect in any way our culture? Because, for example, if you and myself, for example, and people of our generation are in the habit of communicating as you have described right now, but maybe the young generation will take it as a rule that there is no need in the immediate simultaneous feedback, and little by little, step by step, it will change their mentality, their culture of communication, and they will be all right with that.
Yeah, eventually, maybe, but at the moment, no. I've had a lot of chat with younger people, not least my own kids, you know, who are 2 generations down now. You know, I've got the older children who are in their 40s and 50s, and then their children who are teenagers and so on. They have the same problem at the moment. Now, it may evolve, as you say, step by step, so that in due course, the internet generation, those who see the internet as native speakers, as it were, rather than you and me, which is a bit of a foreign language, it may change, but at the moment there isn't very much sign of it. And then on the other hand, the point you also made about to what extent is the internet changing the language? Well, actually, I don't see very much sign of that at the moment. It's early days, of course. One needs to reflect here on the recency of the arrival of the internet. It seems as if it's been with us forever, but when you think of the dates that are involved, the World Wide Web arrives with us in 1991, which is really only, 25 years ago, less than a generation, really.
Right.
And then you go through all the dates. When did, all you people watching this out there, when did you first send an email? And if you're of a certain age, probably mid-90s or something like that, or late 90s. Email has been with us only for about 20 years. When did you first go on Google? Well, you couldn't have done that before 1999. When did you first send a text message? Well, that was round about the same time, 2000 or thereabouts. Blogging, around the same time. The notion of a blog, a weblog, the term appears first in English in 1997, but nobody blogged really until about 2002, 2003. And then chat rooms, well, they were in there in the 90s, but social media, of course, as a development of chat rooms, didn't arrive until when? Well, Facebook, 2004, YouTube, 2005, Twitter, 2006, and then, of course, Instagram and all the other things over the last 10 years. It's all very recent. And those of us in linguistics know that language change is always there, but it takes time for a change to manifest itself and be, as it were, seriously introduced into a language. Now, the internet is certainly speeding things up, but not to the extent that if you did do a sample of internet language as it is now and compare it with pre-internet language of 1990, there aren't that many linguistic differences between the two. You know, what new grammatical structures have entered the language as a result of the internet? I can't think of any. What new vocabulary? Well, yes, a few thousand new words, but English and most languages have hundreds of thousands of words. English, oh, well over 1 million. Nobody knows how many. So a few thousand new words isn't a big deal. Pronunciation, it's a little bit too soon to say because the internet so far has been largely graphic in character. Orthography, yes, that's the area where you see most development, but even so, when you take all the orthographic developments that have taken place, you know, not using so much punctuation in emails, that kind of thing. Even so, it's just a 5%, 10% difference in the orthographic system of the language. So adding all that up, I don't see very much change yet in any language that I've studied, but the one I know best, of course, is English. And there I would say it was something like 5 to 10%, if that. So 90% of the English that we're using now is exactly the same as it was before. In 50 years' time, who knows? But at the moment, I don't think there's cause for the, the prophets of Zoom, prophets of doom.
That's interesting. That's an interesting statement. But I think there are 3 disrupting factors, and I'm just wondering what you think about these things. First of all, we have so many different varieties of English, right? Because we have Englishes, right, in the world, and these Englishes are no less important than the so-called standard English, which is less than 2% in the world, actually. The so-called standard English, and in this sense, we have a universe of varieties of English, right, all over the world. And codification is not something that is superimposed on all of them, because each regional variety may have its own standard, and people will be just more or less trying to satisfy their local requirements in order to be understood by people. That's point one. That's disrupting factor, meaning the language may continue. Well, not language, but speech and communication may continue breeding more varieties of English all over the world, because codification actually goes down, and this will immediately create a great diversity on the one hand. Secondly, we are so far apart from each other, and this creates the expanding universe of communication. People are more and more remote from each other, and they make something that was formerly unthinkable. If in your interpersonal communication you may not think about simplifying a message, in the internet message you are trying to simplify your message very often, thinking that, well, people will not be able to catch what you say. You are trying to use words that will not be so complex. You are trying not to use so many quotations and associations that you would normally use in an interpersonal communication to make the situation lively and funny. You will occasionally quote Shakespeare, occasionally the Bible, occasionally Milton, for example, occasionally some other writers. While in the Zoom communication, you are more or less formalizing this communication. And little by little, step by step, this seemingly unimportant, insufficient background begins to create the framework of reference for communication that is not exactly as it used to be, let's say 30 or 40 years ago. And this will create a crack in communication, and this crack may expand and may actually widen so big, little by step by step, that we begin to notice changes. Noam Chomsky, during one of the interviews, was asked the same questions, but it was a long time ago. And he said, well, I don't think we're going to witness any serious changes in the language as far as I'm still alive and kicking in this life. And also because we have so many different varieties. But do you think that the kind of communication with all those small and minor things may gradually, step by step, create a crack in the system of language here and there occasionally, that will gradually broaden, expand, and let's say in 100 years' time we shall see a different language?
Well, in 1,000 years' time, maybe. Language changes. We look at Old English and Middle English and Shakespearean English and modern English. So in 1,500 years, there has been a huge amount of change. In 400 years, from Shakespeare to now, the change is minor. When you quantify all the differences that have taken place since 1600 to the present day, well, I've done this. If you go to the Shakespeare's Words site, where we bring together all the differences in word meaning between Shakespeare's time and the present day, the total is somewhere around about 5%. In other words, over 90% of Shakespearean vocabulary is exactly the same as it is now. Same point applies to grammar. If you look at all the grammatical differences between 1600 and the present day, they're noticeable, of course, when you see them, hear them in Shakespeare, but they add up to no more than about 5% of difference in the last 400 years. So I think one must not overestimate the amount of change. Now, to take this very important point you've raised about global varieties of English, which is the second big issue you raised at the beginning of this chat we're having. Yes, there are two main forces that drive language. One is the need for intelligibility, which fosters the need for a standard language. The other is the drive for identity, who we are and which community we belong to and which community we do not belong to. And that fosters local varieties. And the big trend over the past 50 years or so has been a noticeable increase, as you said, in the number of local varieties of English, the new Englishes, as they're called, around the world, and other languages, of course, doing similar things, though not with such a dramatic, widespread reach. But it's not just the last 50 years, of course. This is not a novel phenomenon, because varieties of English have been noted and studied ever since, well, probably right from the very beginning, but the really important one was the difference between British English and American English, which of course is now a couple of 100 years old. Now quantify that. How many differences are there between British English and American English? So you go to the dictionaries and you look at all the vocabulary differences, and people have done this. And the answer, once again, is very, very small. We're talking about just a couple of % of differences between vocabulary between British English and American English. Do the same for grammar. I remember when the big Quirk grammar came out, the comprehensive grammar of the English language, I did the index to that book. And altogether in that index, there are about 3,500 entries. So that's the number of points about grammar that there are in the book. If you like, there are sort of 3,500 points of English grammar to be dealt with when you're learning the language. But when you ask the question, and they were very scrupulous about identifying points of difference between British and American English, when you ask how many points of grammatical difference are there between the two varieties, you know, we say it's a quarter to 12. Many Americans, not all, but many Americans say it's a quarter of 12. British English might say, I've just eaten. American English people on the whole say, I just ate. You know, that kind of difference. And once again, we're talking only about 5% or so of difference between the grammar of British and American English. Now, go to other varieties of English around the English-speaking world, and the order of magnitude is not very different. For those that have been studied in the, the relevant journals, and people have collected now the vocabulary of whatever, Indian English, Nigerian English, Singaporean English, and to a lesser extent, the grammar of these varieties. Again, on the whole, we're talking about a very tiny proportion of difference, enough to express local identity, enough to express local culture. But on the whole, when I'm talking to an American, I understand virtually everything that he's saying or she's saying, and vice versa. And the same talking to somebody from Singapore. Now, that's one scenario. The other scenario, of course, is that there are some local varieties that have, for a whole variety of reasons, developed into virtually different languages. So now we're talking about in Singapore, for instance, Singapore Standard Local English, which I understand most of, just like I understand most American English, and then Singlish, which is spoken on the streets, which is a mixture of English and Chinese and a bit of something else as well, and that I do not understand. Or Papua New Guinea, where Tok Pidgin, a pidgin language derived from English, is now largely unintelligible to me. So there are some developments which are radical in the sense that they are evolving into different languages. And these things are happening in parallel with the global varieties that you mention. Now, there are very few of these new Englishes that have become what Tom MacArthur used to call the English family of languages. Very few. They may increase over the next, you said 100, I suspect 1,000 years indeed. But Marklen, in 1,000 years' time, we might all be speaking Martian if they land, you know, who knows what's going to happen in that period of time. At the moment, I don't see it as a crack, as you put it, in communication. Or if you like, to take this room up in the ceiling there is indeed a very thin crack going on. It is not affecting the structure of my house at all, but it is a crack. And if I don't keep an eye on it, it might develop into something in the long term. So I agree with Chomsky here. I don't at the moment see very much difference, or not enough to be worried about, but it does need to be watched and to be monitored. And the more local studies we can make of these varieties, and there are very few at the moment around, the better indeed.
You know, thank you for this comment, Professor Crystal. But there is another very interesting point that I'm facing almost in the beginning of almost every semester. When I enter my online class, I notice that out of 400 students that are registered in my Zoom, because I have sometimes lectures with 400 students simultaneously listening to me, that's incredible. About 250 out of them are Chinese students from China. And here I have huge concerns because I want to be understood. I want to be intelligible to these people. And I want to have some sort of a sensible feedback from them. And therefore, I'm thinking about the standard that I need to teach to these students. Because on one hand, well, I'm saying, all right, I will adhere to the standard grammar of English. And they will, if they want to develop in the future, they need to learn it. Actually substantially. And, but on the other hand, when I start actually speaking to these people, very often they keep silent and I have a feeling that I'm not being understood by these people. More than that, the Chinese population and the Asian population is increasing in the world. And we know that, for example, in the year 2030, there will be no less than 70% of the so-called Zoomers around the world. I mean, young people belonging to the Z generation. And they will speak their variety of English. That is not necessarily standard. And they will begin...
Now, the interesting question is what is the reason for this apparent failure of communication? Now, I don't believe it is a matter of grammar. I don't believe it is a matter of pronunciation. I don't even believe that it's a matter of vocabulary, but I do believe that there is an increasing problem because of differences in culture. In other words, the more fluent one gets in a foreign language, the more one readily expresses in that variety one's culture. That is what the language is for, after all. People who adopt individuals who adopt English, immediately adapt it, as you were saying, to express what? Everything in their culture, their local fauna and flora, the local myths and legends, their local political system, their local personalities on radio and television. They routinely talk about these things. And because it is their natural way of life, they fail to realize that people from outside that cultural background may not understand what they are saying, even though they understand the grammar, they understand the vocabulary, they understand the pronunciation. Everything is clear, except they don't understand the sentence. So I give you an example now. Here is my watch, and I'm saying to you, oh, you know, it's not Bond Street, really. And your friendly foreigner sort of goes, without understanding what I mean at all. Now, I'm not thinking twice about this because I know what Bond Street is. I know it's the most expensive street in London. Basically, what I'm saying is my watch is a very cheap watch. It's not a very expensive watch. But the other person doesn't necessarily know this. Now, I have the opposite problem when I go to, well, in every part of the world I've been to, I'm talking now to a fluent group of people, people who, not learners, early learners, they're people who have mastered English, pretty fluent in it. They make hardly any, as it were, mistakes in the traditional sense. And yet, quite regularly, I'm failing to understand what they're saying because they are instinctively introducing into the conversation, I'm in their country, remember, aspects of the culture, and all I can do is go, yeah, sorry, what do you mean there? But I can't do that all the time, otherwise the conversation breaks down completely. Now, this happens occasionally, even with varieties that I'm very familiar with, like, say, American English. I remember the very first time I went to America years ago, back in the 60s this was, and I go into a cafe, a diner, and I stand in a queue, in a line, and I go to the front of the line, and the guy says, "What do you want?" And I say, "I'd like some eggs." And he says, "How do you like your eggs?" And I did not know what to reply, because this wasn't a typical British question at the time. And I said, "Cooked?" And he looks at me as if I'm mad and says, "Buddy, look, I mean, do you want it once over lightly, sunny side up?" And he rattled off a series of expressions that I now know the meaning of. But at the time, I did not know the meaning of them at all. And that's the kind of thing I mean, that every now and then you encounter a cultural clash. I remember I was in a seminar with an American guy giving a talk, and somebody asked him a question. And he said, "Oh, that's from out of left field." And the person next to me, who was from China, I think actually, nudged me in the ribs and said, "What does that mean?" And I said, "I've no idea," because I did not know. I know now, but at the time I was not familiar with an expression from baseball, which meant that the ball was coming from an unexpected direction. And therefore, out of left field means that was an unexpected question. So a little later in the conversation, I remember trying to get my own back on this American lecturer. And I said, "You played that with a straight bat." And he went, "Huh? What does that mean?" Because, of course, he didn't understand metaphors from cricket, which is very much a British expression. To play it with a straight bat means I am giving you a very firm response, and so on. So yes, cultural expressions from all sorts of walks of life are going to intrude into this kind of thing. And now you, giving your talk, may well have quite inadvertently, quite unconsciously, we all do it, introduce some kind of cultural illusion which might make your audience go, yeah, and you don't get the feedback about it that you were hoping. The more colloquial your style, the more this is likely to happen. I'm doing it all the time because I have a fairly colloquial style. And the more businessmen often talk about this in an international business meeting. Everybody's sitting around the table using English as a standard language of standard lingua franca. And as long as the language stays fairly formal, everybody is happy. But as soon as one of the people in the room starts to use some colloquialisms, then the cultural element starts to intrude, and
exactly, it doesn't ring a bell very often. You pronounce something and you know full well that people simply do not understand it, and it doesn't ring a bell at all. It's very. There are two points to make. Once I was reading to the students a fragment from Ecclesiastes chapter 12. And I said, this is the English Bible. I say, you're supposed to understand everything. And so I say, it begins with, "Remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, while the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them." And right, and then there is the description of something like, "In the day when the keepers of the house shall tremble, and the strong men shall bow themselves, and those that look out of the windows be darkened, and the grinders cease because they are few, and all the daughters of music shall be brought low," and so on and so forth, up until the end. It says, "Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, all is vanity." And they say, do you understand what is being said here in this text? It's an English Bible. And not a single person in the room was actually capable of saying that. I say it's an ancient metaphor. It's an allegory of an old age, describing simply a person who's very old. So the keepers of the house are hands, the strong men are legs, and there's those that look out of the windows bedarkened eyes. And
my reaction to that, if I were talking to that foreign group, would be to say, don't take it personally, guys, because if I made the same quotation that you just did now to most native speakers of English, they wouldn't understand it either.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the difference between the native and the non-native speaker is disappearing when it comes to this question of international communication, because many people who don't have English as a first language take some of the American examples, for instance, or examples from Nigerian English or whatever it is, or New Zealand English or whatever, and say, I didn't understand that. Well, neither did I understand it, you see. It's cultural differences go beyond the distinction between the native and the non-native speaker. Now, how many people in Britain or in any part of the English-speaking world actually know the Bible very well, actually know Shakespeare very well? If they do, then they'll have no trouble in bringing in illusions of that kind. But if they don't, they are at a loss. So when I used to travel around in the old days, pre-COVID, I often used to test this out. I would introduce quotations. No, not quotations. There's a difference here between a quotation and an expression that has entered the language. A quotation has not entered the language in the same sense. I might say, to take a biblical example, a thorn in the flesh, or out of the mouths of babes. These are expressions that have entered the language, whereas the vanity of vanities quotation hasn't entered it in the same way. You have to be really be intellectual, as it were, to understand that. Whereas an ordinary person should understand out of the mouths of babes, for instance. And the same with Shakespeare. Most Shakespearean expressions that have entered the language, there are very few. There aren't that many biblical ones, actually. I wrote a book a few years ago called Begat, yes, the King James Bible in the English language, and tried to answer the question, how many biblical expressions have genuinely entered the language in that way? And the figure I came up with was 257, which was far fewer than many people thought and far more than some other people thought. Do the same thing for Shakespeare, and this has been done several times. I've done it in some of my books and so have others. And only about 60 or 70 expressions from Shakespeare have genuinely entered the language. Everything else is a quotation. So if you now read the newspaper and it says, to vote or not to vote, that is the question. Now, most people, I suspect, would recognize that as a Shakespeare allusion, but not everybody. And I'm talking now not about native and non-native speakers. I'm talking about everybody who uses English might or might not understand that. So we're talking here, I think, about education in a more general sense. To what extent should education teach us about the Bible, teach us about Shakespeare? Once it does, then the linguistic issue becomes secondary, and one gradually gets to know the world that we're talking about here. It could be anything, could be Chaucer, could be Old English, could be Jane Austen, could be anybody, really.
The question then is what we're going to teach in the universities, because for example, if we're teaching just everyday communication and a primitive vocabulary that people can use in everyday communication, meaning it becomes very, very primitive. And once I had a nice discussion with the Vice Chancellor of Moscow State University, academician Sadovnichi, and while we were having coffee somewhere standing, and he was saying to me in a very humorous way, saying, do you know, Marklen, he say, how the new ideas win the old ones? I say, well, no idea. He said, those people who were promoting the old ideas simply physically die.
Oh, yes.
Right.
Absolutely. This is a great truth, a very wise man, your Vice Chancellor, evidently. Yeah.
Right.
The question for the teacher, I think, is how you handle this. And the answer is that you must not think of it as being something at an advanced level of learning the language. In other words, you learn English and then you tack on at the end the more sophisticated, literary, institutionalized, and so on, and issues about varieties of English. No, that is not how I see it. And having, I am not an English language teacher in that sense, but having observed and been in many classes and seen and discussed with teachers how to do this, the best solution I have found is to drip, 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 drip. In other words, from the very beginning of the English teaching course, one introduces a small element of language variation, cultural variation. So one is teaching at a certain point in time, shall we say, the present perfect, I have been, I have gone. At that point, one might introduce the difference between British and American English, where Americans on the whole don't use that so much in this context. They might say, I just ate, the example we used a little while ago. And if you look at all the cultural variations that there are, these are not systematically addressed in textbooks, in course books. When you look at the way a course book is written and a grammatical point is introduced, and then there is a little story attached to it. Let us go to the zoo. Let us go to church. Let us go to shopping in Bond Street or what have you. And the point of the story that's attached is to illustrate the grammatical form that is being taught. Why not at that particular point also introduce the cultural point as well? So if we are shopping in Bond Street, this is not because we're going to illustrate the use of the present tense in buying something only. Let's just talk a little bit about the fact that Bond Street is a very expensive street, and it's different, and its way, and so on. And if one introduces culturally throughout the entire syllabus, then actually one covers these points more rapidly than one might expect.
But that's a very important point. I want my colleagues actually who are going to attend to this lecture, to this dialogue between ourselves, to note that.
I was very happy when I learned some foreign languages years ago. I was delighted when I'm now thinking of a BBC course called Komm mit, wir sprechen Deutsch, which I learned my German from years and years and years ago. And it was very interesting. John Trim was one of the linguistic advisors, and the opening lesson, I remember it clearly now, started to teach some basic forms of German, as you'd expect. And then for 5 minutes at the end of the program, there was about 20 minutes altogether. For 5 minutes, the presenter said, now we're going to go to a bar in Berlin or somewhere, and we're just going to hear a couple of people chatting every day. You won't understand it. Don't worry about that. Just listen to the rhythm, to the intonation, to the way they use these little words like noch, that are going to be so important for you to learn later. Just get the feel for it. And do you know, that changed my perception of German totally. It suddenly became a real language right from the very beginning. Now one can do exactly the same thing in the English domain, introducing occasional colloquialisms, introducing language variation from all the way through the syllabus. And of course, if there's a literary dimension here, you can build that in at the same time.
May I ask you one last question? I think we've just a little bit already just out of time. Do you seriously believe that if, for example, in the coming 50 or 100 years, the demographic structure of the world population will change, and for example, we shall have the predominance of Asians and Chinese people, for example, and people of other nations, do you think they will make a preference in favor of English in the future? Do you think they will continue actually supporting the English standard and the English as international language of communication rather than choosing their native tongues like Chinese or
fascinating question, and an impossible one. Any questions about the future of language are really questions about the future of society and about the future of politics and economics and everything. After all, 1,000 years ago, if you had said, in 1,000 years' time, none of you will understand Latin, or hardly anybody, they'd have thought you were mad. In 1,000 years' time, will English still be the dominant language? Who knows? As I said before, it might be Martian. The statistics at the moment are very interesting. I've done a review of how many people speak English in the world 3 times now for the Cambridge Encyclopedia of the English Language. In the first edition in 1997, having reviewed as best one can, using all the sources of information that's available. It's always guesswork because no country keeps accurate census statistics on language use. Nonetheless, the feeling was that the conclusion I came to was 1.5 billion people were using English around the world at a reasonably conversational level. It's 1,500 million. That was 1997. 2003, for the second edition, the figure had grown to 2 billion, 2,000 million. And it wasn't just my figure, because people like David Gradol and Tom MacArthur were reaching similar conclusions. The third edition of the encyclopedia came out just 2 years ago, and I did exactly the same exercise. And the conclusion was 2.3 billion people were now using English around the world. Now notice, 2.3. If the same rate of increase had taken place between 1997 and 2003, where 500 million extra people come on board, over the last 15 years, you would have expected English now to be spoken by around 3 billion people. But it was only 2.3. In other words, the rate of increase of English seems to have slowed a bit. Why? Why? Indeed. All sorts of theories come to mind now. Maybe the number of people who need English as an international language is reaching its limit, as David Gradol would have argued. Maybe the need for a lingua franca is only to a certain extent. It is not necessary for everybody in the world to learn a lingua franca. Maybe other languages are developing their scenarios so that they have their eye on one day becoming an international lingua franca. As you say, it could be Chinese, though there isn't very much sign of that at the moment in China. It could be Arabic, if you think of a different scenario. Could be Spanish, which is still the fastest growing language in the world, when you think of Latin America and so on. So there are all these alternative scenarios, but to predict which is going to be the dominant one is a futurologist who is a sociologist and an economist and a politician, rather than a linguist.
Thank you. Professor Crystal, this was very useful. I'm sure my colleagues in the university, in both universities, the Financial University and the Moscow State University, will find this discussion extremely useful. And I'm sure we shall have hundreds of hours of conversation and talks around this dialogue, and our students will also participate, I'm sure. So,
well, it's been a delight. Thank you very much for your interest and for these fascinating questions, for the opportunity to talk like this in this kind of way. I hope it will be of use, and I look forward to the next step in our conversation on these.
Is going to be on the 25th of January. We're going to have these questions and answer sessions. People are already warned about that, so we shall have an audience.
Lovely. Well, I look forward to that, and I hope we'll get some interesting stories as well as questions, and let the whole thing develop.
Thank you so much, Professor Crystal. It was a pleasure. It was a great pleasure. Bye-bye.
Been a pleasure. Till next time.
Thank you. Till next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.